Thank you all very much for having us today. As was mentioned, I'm the CEO of Lucidworks. If you're not familiar with Lucidworks, we provide a search analytic and AI platform that's used across many use cases, knowledge management being a key one, obviously, in terms of all the content and data and the need for access out there. What we thought we'd talk about today was a trend that we're starting to see that's really transforming the way organizations think about data, the way they think about their content and their information, and more importantly, the way they think about their workers, particularly the knowledge workers, and the transition that's happening away from simply being a gatekeeper of content, but an enabler of information within an organization. And more importantly, as we sort of transition our operations towards cloud services, private clouds, public clouds, on-prem, the ability to reference an API which has access to all of the content, all of the knowledge, really drives that portability of applications. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about smart applications and where the cloud is starting to play, and really where you all as the knowledge and content professionals are going to play a critical role in this digital transformation. So not an advertisement, but just, again, a quick background on who we are. Lucidworks, again, working in search for many years. We started out as an open source company, kind of like the Red Hat for Apache Solar. We've shifted over the last couple of years to provide a more comprehensive offering to our platform, things that can address some of the challenges that are going on around enterprise search, knowledge management, research and development portals, and that's a product that we call Fusion. We work with a number of customers across multiple verticals, and so as you all know, this is not a problem that's isolated to a particular vertical or particular industry. It's something that's pervasive across all industries, whether it be financial services, healthcare, nonprofits, government agencies. Just one of the most challenging problems that really is yet to be completely solved as well, which is great for all of us from a job security standpoint. So when you think about search, and sort of what's been happening over the years, I kind of look at these sort of paradigm shifts, because in the old days, we used to think about data, and we used to think about access to data. We had these highly structured data stores, these data warehouses, these relational databases, and we'd use tools like our BI tools to kind of come in and extract information and intelligence out of that data. Well, as the world is shifting, and as we all know, that it's not just the document repositories, the file systems, but there's APIs, there's services, there's social media, there's all of these areas in which we're extracting information. The need for more flexible access to that information, more natural access to that information is critical. And so search has sort of been playing that role in that transformation of allowing us to leverage more of the content that's out there, and not just sort of sticking to these traditional paradigms, but really evolving to the opportunities that exist behind all this data. And we've seen applications where we're starting to drive smarter experiences in sort of three key areas. And I've got some examples of companies that have been really kind of leading the charge in those areas. But your productivity applications, your knowledge, your enterprise search, your research and development portals, customer experience is starting to intersect in a major way, because it's not any good if we're simply keeping all of this important information sort of locked away or only using it internally to try to drive leverage, but we actually want to try to drive a better experience for customers. And by the way, these are internal customers and external customers, but when we're serving the business, when we're serving a need, it's important that we can drive a better experience around that data and around that content. And then an interesting trend that we're starting to see where content analytics and text analytics are starting to play a major role is this idea of operational intelligence, where organizations are saying, okay, there's a lot more to a document. There's relationships in that document. There's people in those documents who represent expertise within an organization. And so how do we go in and how do we extract all that information? And so this is a really exciting time for us at Lucidworks, because we're seeing our customers who have been more in these sort of traditional silos of thinking of, okay, I've got to federate across all of these data sources. I've got to onboard new CMS systems. I've got to leverage new sources of data, to suddenly thinking about ways that they can drive the business forward. And again, it's been really exciting to see the adoption across lots of different companies sort of leading that charge. These trends are continuing to grow, obviously, and so we don't see this slowing down anytime soon. There's new use cases and new things coming online, and so this looks a little bit like I'm speaking at like an analyst conference, but I just, again, want to reinforce the fact that there's a major shift going on. And the folks in this room are going to play a key role within the enterprise in driving that shift as they sort of enter into these new paradigms. The other thing about search and really smarts and content comes down to how do we get to the point of that application experience? You know, all too often we tend to think about, okay, we're going to load in a bunch of data, we're going to tune some relevancy, and we're going to call it a day. But again, content in its natural form is full of a lot of intelligence. It's full of a lot of information that goes beyond just the text, right? Again, it's the classification of that text. It's the relationships. I often talk to my customers about, you know, consider yourself in like your own private planet, right? And there's all kinds of, there's continents and oceans and lakes and rivers and valleys and gullies, and well, all of that is within your continent. And as an explorer, if you want to get from point A to point B, it's important that we have a full survey, a full understanding. And so it's simply not enough to say, okay, I'm going to provide this data, I'm going to put it back in front of my user. We want to extract as much intelligence out of that data as possible and start connecting the dots so we can find these relationships that exist beyond some of the obvious sort of keyword matching, but more of a topical extraction, classification. Again, people are a really interesting aspect of content within an organization, trying to understand expertise. We still couple that with this idea of telemetry data, which is looking at the way users are behaving, looking at the way users are interacting. Are they solving their problem? Are they finding the things they're looking for? We can implement these in different ways within our organization. Some people like to look at things like click-through rates. That's not necessarily a definitive metric. We're more interested in looking at areas where we can provide voting and sort of explicit user feedback, kind of like the world of e-commerce, where how do we know that a search was successful in e-commerce? Well, they bought something, right? So in the case of knowledge management, in the case of content analytics, we want to ensure that people are actually answering questions. And we can leverage that feedback along with the intelligence around the content, and that's how we drive this sort of smarter application experience. And so I tend to think of this as continuum, because as we know, not every application is going to be smart overnight. And in fact, sometimes our bandwidth simply doesn't allow us to take advantage of all of these different techniques. So I like to think about applications as they sort of go through this continuum of maturity and sophistication, and we can determine as the content and knowledge professionals, when are we going to take a certain application to a certain period, to a certain stage, and when do we simply need to get more things online. And so this continuum that we use to kind of help guide people through this process, it starts out with your operations. You know, what is going to be your system of record? Where are you going to store this information? Can you get data in of it? Can you get data out of it? Obviously, that's sort of limited in thinking around the scope of what's out there. And so we need to start thinking about applications, and we need to think about all of the different areas in which our content and our data lives. And once we're there, there's sort of the age-old problem that we hear every day as search professionals, which is, I still can't find anything. So we're going back and we're starting to tune relevancy, and we're thinking about relevancy in terms of what's important to our users, what's interesting about particular pieces of content. Can we start to look at users' intentions so we can get into more of a question and answering? And then, of course, because everybody's seen Jeopardy, and I can't tell you the number of CIOs who come to me and say, well, I just want that Watson thing to just talk back to me, right? And that's sort of what I call sort of the very tippy top, the intelligence aspect, or where we're getting this sort of feedback loop. And, you know, it would be great, and it is great, and there's ways to get there, and companies like ourselves are happy to get there. There's a lot of folks here who know how to get here, but this is not an overnight thing, and it requires a lot of investment and a lot of training. And so organizations need to understand that, yes, while we want every application to behave like a Siri or behave like a Watson, the reality is that we've got competing priorities in terms of the number of initiatives going on at any given day, how far we can take certain things. It might be more important to get half a dozen applications to stage 3 or stage 2 before we start thinking about stage 3 in a given calendar year. And so you're probably thinking, what the heck does this have to do with cloud and that? But I wanted to kind of frame the way at least we think about the problem, because again, I think we tend to take a siloed approach in terms of the fact that there's a lot of demands from the business, there's a lot of demands from our users, and how do we start to address those, and how do we keep up with that flow? But if you think about it in a more proactive way, you're holding the key to all of this intelligence behind an enterprise. And our goal should be, how do we turn that into leverage? How do we start to extract more meaning, more relationships, more context from our data that we can use to drive initiatives forward, and do so in a much more competitive and a much more agile way? So the cloud. Again, this huge shift that we're all seeing, and I think everybody's aware of it. And what's really interesting when you go and you think about access technology is that it sort of creates this ubiquitous relationship between data and applications. Because if I have a single point to go in and retrieve information, and if that point can be smart, it doesn't matter where it's running. I tell people every day, your users actually don't care about your infrastructure, believe it or not. They're not sitting here like, oh, I wonder if they're running on Amazon or if they're running on, no, they don't care. They care about the experiences that we're gonna drive for them. Your developers tend to not care unless they're responsible for DevOps and things of that nature. And so if we start thinking about what we're doing is simply being a window into all of this content, wherever it may live, wherever it may shift, wherever it may move, whatever velocity it's coming in, maybe we acquired a company and we're bringing on systems that we have never supported before, we can start to just think about this simple API that we can provide back to the business. That is the key to all of our knowledge. It's the key to all of our understanding of the data that we have at our disposal. Now, this isn't like, meant to be a tech talk, and this isn't about, okay, we've got microservices and yada, yada, yada. But the reality is that as we think about our text analytics, our content initiatives, there's a lot of capability that exists beyond just that simple access point, right? There's all the things that we do to bring data into these systems that we're familiar with, the different data sources, the different adapters, the things that we need to go and retrieve information for. And as we talked about earlier, it's not simply enough to say, okay, I've taken it, thrown it in an index, come type in some keywords and come find it, but we want to enrich that data as much as possible using text analytics, using classification, so we can provide more intelligence around what's there, extracting that information. And again, that same simple paradigm can start to leverage all of these really powerful ideas in terms of how people are migrating through different environments, how they're able to deploy and minimize disruption as they make these transitions away from on-premise applications into the cloud. And then, of course, on the retrieval side, as the search professionals and users and developers, there's a lot of techniques that go into that as well. So we can start to drive different ranking and different contextual targeting of information back into our users, trying to understand intention, trying to eventually move up that paradigm to get to that more kind of Watson-like experience where we can start to converse with our data. And even further, we're seeing trends around things like personalization and recommendations. I think a lot about retail just because I think it's one of the areas that we have experienced data discovery the most firsthand, right? You think about the ability of Amazon to take, billion-plus items within a catalog and send you an email with these 3 things that you didn't really think you needed to buy, but now that you see it, you're like, huh, now you mentioned I might actually engage with that content. Well, we can start to take the same approach within our content applications, our enterprise search applications, and we're seeing more and more of that, this understanding that, hey, that telemetry data and the way the users are interacting is telling us something. And so, again, I think the biggest message from me today, and as we kind of meet with a number of customers and a number of people here today at the show, is to really start thinking about how can I become that data hero. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. How can I become that data hero within an organization? How am I creating leverage out of all of the information that I have at my disposal? Because it's not just important to show up within a portal, within an intranet, to be a part of a specific application. There's so much more value in that content, in that user behavior. And if we start to take advantage of that, again, we're going to drive such a competitive advantage within our organizations. But it's going to take a mental shift about the way that we think about our jobs, the way that we think about the functions of the applications and the technologies that we're responsible for, and starting to align those capabilities with where the business is headed, where the threats lie, where the opportunities lie. And really the data and the access to that data and the understanding of the content behind that data is going to be key to that transformation. So I want to thank you all. I know it's a early morning, last day keynote, so that can be a little bit tiring. It sounds like we have a break here. Please, if you want to talk more, if you have any questions, you can come find myself. There'll be other members of the Lucidworks team out here on the floor. And enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.